Clock has ticked over to 4 o'clock, which means we're ready to go. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for coming to Curtin Corner. You're in the right spot if that's where you want to be. I'm John Phillimore. I'm the Executive Director of the John Curtin Institute of Public Policy, and it's a great delight to have you here at Curtin Corner this afternoon. And if you've never been to Curtin Corner, welcome. And if you've been before, welcome back. Of course, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners of the lands from which we are hosting today's webinar, and from wherever you're watching from, on your behalf, I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners and their elders past and present. And if you've never attended a Curtin Corner before, you might be interested to know that we have been doing this for about 20 years, running Curtin Corners on a Friday afternoon with speakers from inside and outside the university on a wide range of topics. We used to do them in-house. We've now gone online mostly, but we do occasionally have in-person seminars as well. And I'll talk about our next one, which is actually in a fortnight's time, the last one for the year, and that will be an in-person event. But tonight we're on a webinar. We do record the sessions and put them up on our website. So please take the time to look at our past talks and encourage your colleagues to do the same. So if you have people who couldn't attend this evening, you will be able to watch that later on. It takes a little while to go up on our website, but we also get them on our YouTube channel, and I can send out the links to the talk reasonably quickly next week. So all of our this year's presentations are there, and including ones also from previous years, where you'll see our speaker, who's also done a few Curtin Corners for us in the past. We do like to encourage debate and discussion, so later we will invite you to ask questions using an app called Slido, S-L-I-D-O. It's extremely easy to use. Just download Slido from the App Store, or you can go to www.slido.com and do it from there. But once you're in, you have to put in an event code. Our event code is very easy. It's JCIPP. So just JCIPP, and that'll come up. And I'll put up a question there so you know you're in the right spot. You can submit your own question or just like somebody else's, and I'll then facilitate the discussion with Kantha after she's finished her prepared remarks. And it's always easiest to use Slido on your phone and just watch the presentation on your computer or your tablet at the same time. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kantha Dayaram, who's Professor of Employment Relations and Labour Policy in the School of Management and Marketing in the Faculty of Business Law at Curtin University, the same school in which JCIPP is located. Kantha has a doctorate in public policy and governance, a dual master's in leadership and health economics from the London School of Economics, and she's got expertise in workplace regulation, psychosocial safety, gender dynamics, organisational responses to violence and harassment. And she's got a background in economics, labour regulation and policy. She's presented her work on violence and harassment to the International Labour Organisation, which is based in Geneva. She's contributed to government policy through Senate submissions, Commission reports on workplace responses to safety. And she's also, very importantly, presented at Curtin Corner a number of times previously on issues connected to sexual harassment in the workplace. And that's a theme she returns to today. And it's very timely because WA is preparing to commence the annual 16 Days in WA Stop Violence Against Women campaign that begins next Tuesday. And in fact, Kantha has a presentation that she'll be giving at an event next week. She'll talk to you about at the very end of her presentation. So Kantha, it's great to have you on board again. Lovely to see you. And we're looking forward to what you've got to say. Over to you.
Thank you, John. Always a pleasure to be presenting at the JCIPP public lectures. I too would like to pay my respects and acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, past and present, and any First Nations people who are present online, as well as the original custodians of the unceded land on which I live and work. This particular presentation is based on the research that my colleagues, Dr. Mihaela Gavin from University of Technology, Sydney, and Dr. Renata Casado from University of Western Australia who have done. And this particular research piece was funded by the Department of Communities. As John has just said, this is all part of we basically disseminating our findings to align with the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence as set out by the United Nations. Now we're looking at the efficacy of family and domestic violence leave and why that is a workplace matter. And that's predominantly because where it's at, it was regarded as more of a private matter that occurred outside of the workplace. But as I go through, I will show you some, figures and the ongoing issues around this. So in terms of prevalence rates, 1 in 3 people globally, and this is by the World Health Organization's data, which repeatedly shows more women are impacted by family and domestic violence. And this was, some of their latest findings as well, where we've got 1 in 3 women exposed to family and domestic violence. Within Australia, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics Personal Safety Survey, there's also show that 20% of people since the age of 15 reported intimate partner violence. Now, some of the literature calls it family and domestic violence. Some refer to it as intimate partner violence. And they find that women are disproportionately affected. And that's not to say that men aren't affected by it, but we are finding that on average, again, 1 in 3 women. Intimate partner violence makes up 5.1% of the disease burden for women aged between 15 and 44, and that is massive when you look at the impact on the individual person, families, communities, and more broadly in terms of the healthcare system, as well as society overall, resulting in intimate partner violence as having a more severe health impact than smoking or obesity. And we do know that smoking and obesity are major health concerns. So for intimate partner violence to have a more severe health impact, that is a big concern. John just mentioned that I've been invited to present at the UN's International Labour Organization in Geneva. And so looking at the ILO and their Convention 190, they basically say that domestic violence impacts employment, productivity, health and safety, market institutions. So it's a broad range and therefore not confined just to the individual. Why is family and domestic violence a workplace matter? Because its impact cuts across the individual, the organizational level, as well as more broadly, national and societal level. The impact on work performance, family and domestic violence causes decreased concentration. Somebody obviously who's been exposed to violence is not going to be giving off the same level of performance as someone who hasn't. So it leads to performance issues. There's also absenteeism, both by victim survivors, and we use the term here, victim survivors, because that is what the literature more broadly refers to, people who have been, who have experienced acts of violence. And then perpetrators, again, the literature refers to them as perpetrators, those who enact violence and harassment. So both perpetrators and victim survivors tends to affect them in terms of taking time off work for a number of reasons. And then there's also job loss suffered amongst employees who are exposed to incidents of violence. It leads to turnover rates where they tend not to return to work or to the same workplace after taking time off. The absenteeism then may also translate to overtime impacts on co-workers. It translates to taking time off for family members who attend court or provide support in terms of accompanying them to healthcare centers to seek medical support, to find alternate accommodation, safety, places of safety, etc. So it does have an impact on work performance in a more broader spectrum than just the individual. The workplace is also a prevention site. And as I will show you quotes from the data we've collected, where victim survivors see it as also a space where they can get away from the violence that takes place more domestically. And so workplaces serve as critical environments for preventing violence through support and awareness programs. It provides space away from the perpetrator. And for every worker who is in the workplace who's experienced family and domestic violence, there is a perpetrator also in the workplace. So in that particular workspace, it doesn't necessarily mean that both the perpetrator and victim survivor tend to work in the same workplace. But we do know that, again, data that shows us and various studies that show us that perpetrators tend to also use workplace equipment, etc., to perpetrate violence, whether it's online, coercive control, etc. Organizations have a role to play in terms of, like I say, if we've got perpetrators and victim survivors in workplaces, then the employer culture policies can aid recovery, or depending on the type of culture, can worsen harm from the FDV impacts. In saying that, workplaces do have a role to play in breaking the cycle, and not just only from providing safe workplaces, but also in terms of educating perpetrators in the workplace or people who are likely to enact such incidents of crime and violence. Now, a number of studies, more recently, Guthrie and Barbeck, their paper in 2021 was published that looked at it more from a legal perspective. And then I spoke about the United Nations International Labour Organization. As part of the Centennial outcome in 2019, they had legislated the Convention 190, which was basically where they broadened the definition of violence and harassment. And I'll go a little bit into detail with that. But pretty much what it is, as I showed you, that globally 1 in 3 women are exposed to family and domestic violence. That is also the case in Australia, while we got 1 in 5 people who are exposed to intimate partner violence from the age of 15. And so that is showing us that there's gender-based violence, which includes sexual harassment and is not compatible with decent work. And it does not discriminate in terms of sector, pay levels, etc. It shows that people, whether they're in high-level positions, public sector, private sectors, and not-for-profit sector, are also exposed to and have experienced family and domestic violence, if not some other type of gender-based violence. FDV transcends the private spheres, so it might occur in a private environment, but as I just showed, people experiencing FDV enter the workplace. And so this is where it blurs the boundary between work and home life. The same happens with perpetrators who enacted in a private space at home into the workspace. But we've also got a number of studies where work equipment, etc., are used to perpetrate violence. So, as one of the delegates who worked in the space with Convention 190, which took almost a decade in the making before the convention was implemented, states that it impacts women because work is also economic security. It's a way of providing that type of fallback and safety that when somebody experiences family and domestic violence, if they want to leave that relationship, then they have this economic independence. The ILO as pretty much just moving this. The Violence and Harassment Convention 190, like I said, took a decade in the making and came out, was basically globally a number of countries, then member nations, started ratifying that convention as of 2019. What that particular convention did and why it is very important and relevant, it broadened the scope and definition of violence and harassment, in that violence and harassment doesn't have to be only physical assault. It can be anything that can be, from something like harassment, online harassment. It can be sending somebody messages. And so it has a broad range that can be anything from ongoing verbal harassment, emails, sending messages, etc., right through to serious assault. The definition was also expanded from employee, which means someone who is working and employed with certain work type of arrangements, to capture more broadly workers. That is important because in that definition, it then captures people who are on part-time contracts as well as casual work arrangements. It broadened the scope of where work occurs, and that work doesn't have to be in a specific co-located geographic work location. It can be online work, and we see this now that where we have more rapid rise in remote work, in online work, etc. So it now captures that. It also captures world of work where it doesn't have to happen at work. It can happen going to work. It can happen at a conference. It can happen at a workplace gathering. And so therefore, violence and harassment that takes place in this particular sphere becomes a workplace issue. It can also be violence and harassment can be gender-based violence. It can be sexual harassment, and now we bring in family and domestic violence into that spectrum. In terms of where Australia sits, the International Convention was implemented and introduced in 2019. Australia ratified it in 2023, but enforced it in 2024. In doing that, nation states then also, once they ratified the global standard or convention, they also then look at nationally what are some of the legislations and interventions that they will put in place. And so Australia did have, and in some organizations that this happened, as well as different states and territories, where we did have paid or unpaid family and domestic violence leave. Well, what was very important here is in 2023, federally and across all states and territories, the Australian government introduced 10 days of family and domestic violence leave. And this is paid leave, which then means that all workers are entitled to this, and this includes those people who work on part-time contracts, full-time, and casual employees. It requires all Australian employers with 15 or more to offer this leave, and that was as of 2023. And then later in the year, the same entitlement came into effect for smaller businesses with fewer than 15 employees. That was to allow smaller businesses some time to be able to put in mechanisms, policies, etc., in place so that this legislation comes into effect. Now, it's also important that it is sitting under the national employment standards, which means it's a minimum entitlement. It's a protected attribute. That means no work organization or no employer can or should discriminate against somebody requesting for this minimum entitlement. And that's when it becomes a breach of the work standards, because it's sitting as a very basic entitlement. And so people who are accessing this can use that period of time to access a range of support. And the range of supports can be anything from wanting the time off to seek safe alternate accommodation. It can be to seek medical assistance. It can be to seek family support. Again, it can also look at person using it to seek workplace supports, for instance, requesting for flexible work arrangements, or to move children out from, current unsafe places like, schools, etc., and find them more safe spaces. Now, that particular leave is on an annual basis, which means it's pro rata. For someone working part-time on, let's say, 0.6, they would be getting 6 days of leave. A casual worker would get according to their rostered time. The leave doesn't carry over to the next year, but it renews annually. And so the clock resets. And so given that it came into effect as of 2023, we did look at it as an 18-month period to see how effective has this leave been in terms of doing what it was set out to do, and are workers actually accessing this leave? And how are workplaces also responding now that we've got this paid family and domestic violence leave? So we basically did a multi-stakeholder perspective to get triangulation of data and get different perspectives. And so we started off with applying for ethics approval, because this is very sensitive data that's being collected. And because 3 universities are involved in the study, we landed up applying for ethics approval across all 3 institutions and getting that approval. And so we collected data using semi-structured interview protocols with 38 stakeholders from employers, private sector, public sector, the not-for-profit sector, as well as small businesses. We had union representatives. We looked at civic organizations, those who provide support to people who experience family and domestic violence. And we also interviewed representatives from community legal centers, since they are very important providers of legal advice, as well as support in terms of where, especially with rights and entitlements for people who need to retain their work. And as I said, that's where there's the economic independence and dependence, etc. So community legal centers are, a vital lifeblood in providing that particular support. So we reached out to them and conducted some interviews. Simultaneously, we had an online survey, and the reason for the online survey with victim survivors, meaning those people with lived experience of family and domestic violence, we did this as an online data collection method to allow for people to undertake the survey in a space that was safe for them, at a time that was safe for them, because not everybody who experiences family and domestic violence tend to leave that violent relationship. What research shows us, it takes on average 8 times before somebody leaves a violent relationship. And if there's coercive control, it makes it even harder and more challenging to leave that violent relationship. So we needed to ensure that we provided a safety mechanism. So the online survey was there for somebody to undertake it at a safe, space and time. We also provided the wording was very sensitive. We provided a number of information where support could be accessed. We also ensured that those who were experiencing trauma could at any point in time discontinue taking that survey and seeking assistance wherever and support wherever they needed, or if they wanted to retake the survey, we also provided that type of avenue. And then what we did was we did provide a column where any victim survivor who wanted to be contacted and wanted to provide further information that we had not asked in that survey and they wished to share, we provided again alternatives for that. And we did have 8 victim survivors then provide their contact details we had a few more who have since come back, and so we've kept that avenue open as well. But for this particular presentation, we're reporting on the first 8 voluntary individual interviews, knowing that our participants there experienced severe trauma and wanted to share their experience because they are in the workplace. Now, our findings. There was the Flinders review that was undertaken the report came out in 2024, and this was after the federal government had introduced the 10 days of paid family and domestic violence. And so given that, there's been a lot of write-up, etc., in terms of, is this leave being used? The ABC reported again in June 2024 that domestic violence leave has been a law for a year and almost no one uses it. And like I say, our research is ongoing, but we've gone and collected a lot of our data post 2024 into 2025, which means we've had a good 18 months and soon will be coming almost to 24 months. And this is what we found. One of our victim survivors said, it was really helpful because my funds was controlled by the abuser, so the money helped sustain me while attending court, meaning that they were able to continue working and accessing this leave. So the paid family and domestic violence leave is definitely something that's seen as a positive win by virtually all our stakeholders, as well as victim survivors. However, what it did come out was that it seems that nobody knew how to deal with it regarding timesheets, pay categories. There was no option to apply for FDV on the program. I emailed my manager, who told me I could have the day off. And after taking that day off, it was put down as annual leave. I complained to my senior, and then that was rectified. So what that basically is showing that workplaces themselves, and this is 2025, post 18 months, are still unclear as to which leave, because we've got annual leave, we've got paid family and domestic violence leave, which is on top of the annual leave. And so there's also personal leave. And so there seems to be some confusion in terms of organizations and how they are managing that. And then we've had some of our stakeholders basically say it's not being used or taken up anywhere near enough. And this is from one of the domestic violence service providers. Trade unions said it's not being accessed to its full availability in any shape or form. Employers, on the other hand, said we didn't have any case of someone accessing the family and domestic violence leave, which doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't happen. So what we are seeing, while the ABC reported that it's been a year, what we are seeing post that year, there's still a lot of confusion, and that it is not being, this entitlement is not being really accessed the way it was proposed to be. So definitely there's low uptake in terms of the utilization of paid FDV leave. This was also another concerning remark that came up not just once, a number of times, both in the online survey as well as in our interviews with victim survivors. On my return to work, having taken 20 days of paid leave, because some organizations have been a bit more supportive in giving more than the 10 days of paid leave. And we're seeing that especially in the banking sector, which have been leaders in this particular areas. So this particular respondent says, I stepped back from my substantive leadership role to heal from injury suffered as a result of severe family and domestic violence. I was treated like an injured worker, requiring rehabilitation. It was a distressing process exacerbated by my mental health. I was not permitted to return to my substantive leadership role until I undertook an independent medical assessment by a clinical psychiatrist. I required advocacy from my union to challenge the mandated HR process. I felt the process was discriminatory. On my return to work following union representation, I was then served a performance improvement plan and felt bullied and harassed by my employer. Ultimately, I resigned and left the organization. That seems to be I wouldn't say common, but a repeated trend that we've been hearing, that where organizations were supportive with the paid family and domestic violence leave in terms of how they managed it post accessing the leave was also one that was traumatizing. And again, there seemed to be a lack of process in how this should be done. And then we've also had others say, I offered to give information, but they said they didn't require it. This saved me stress and anxiety and meant I didn't have to give all of my personal information. It was embarrassing enough having the situation. So you've got some organizations that are requesting for burdening proof of evidence, while others are a bit more understanding in terms of the support that they are providing. What we have done was my research team and I looked at this and then put this in terms of looking at all of our data sets from the 3 different methodologies we've used. And we put it under awareness. We found that workers had a lack of awareness and confidence in accessing this. And I'll show you a bit more evidence around this. We also found employers with a lack of information, but also having misknowledge of it in terms of what leave should be taken and how much of leave. Yet, like I said, this is a protected attribute, meaning that it must be given if requested, and evidence or documents are provided. There's also evidence that workplaces are not connecting the dot in terms of seeing family, the relationship with family and domestic violence and workplaces, and how this then it transcends into the different spaces. Vulnerable workers, especially casual employment workers and those on gig work, etc. And again, different sectors in hospitality and where there's care sector, again, where there's a dominance of casual employment, tend to seem to be unaware or mismanaging how that paid leave should be or can be accessed. There's a lot of the access seems to be predicated on trusting that the report system will not have negative consequences or lead to reprisals. There's definitely, and this has just been repeated across the board, fear, stigma around needing to access this leave, a lot of shame, by victim survivors who've experienced violence and assault. Then, like I said, there's a burden on the workplace, as if taking the leave then means it impacts negatively on co-workers, it's being unfair to others, and what will be the career consequences for someone who experiences family and domestic violence. In terms of access, the current legislation itself seems to have some gaps in how it is worded, because it does provide access to leave for those who are supporting victims of family and domestic violence. But then it talks about immediate family and kinship. However, what we have found that Indigenous and culturally diverse groups who they seek support from doesn't necessarily mean it's immediate family. And so it does mean then that they're disadvantaged, or their support networks are disadvantaged from accessing paid leave. Where we also came across this with casual workers, they tend to be disadvantaged in that they rostered, they removed from rosters if they are experiencing family and domestic violence, which then means that they are not able to access the paid family and domestic violence. It just means they're not rostered on those days. So, which then also disadvantages them in terms of access to income. Our respondents spoke about breaches as well as concerns regarding their privacy, confidentiality, etc. There were concerns around safe reporting. And then it was around gendered bias, that women were disadvantaged because they were seen as taking advantage of this leave. And so therefore, if they used up the leave, then it was also seen as single events that the failure to recognize or having training provided to first level responders that FDV is not a single event, and somebody might access it in year 1 and probably access it in year 6 because it involves children, etc., and its families. So there's a lack of awareness, and this is where the gender bias comes in, especially where it is very gendered workplaces. Our respondents spoke about coercive control, especially in work arrangements for fly-in, fly-out and remote work, where there were partners working remote or fly-in, fly-out arrangements, then using coercive control to see what is happening in the workplace, including things like checking in when somebody has logged into their computers or their mobile phones being monitored. The same goes with vehicles that have got tracking devices, etc. So it's work sites being used to perpetuate coercive control. Then it was also safety plans and protection. Some of our respondents spoke about their workplaces and business websites putting up their information and their email contact details, which perpetrators are able to access, and or where their information is put onto sites like LinkedIn, etc., and then perpetrators are getting into those sites and finding their whereabouts, especially if they've left violent relationships and are seeking this, safety protection. So then it's workplaces not providing that type of training to say, well, we don't need to be putting on victim survivors' details on our website as a way of providing them with this protection. There was also, again, confusion, and not only confusion on the access to entitlement when it comes to flexible work arrangements, but also in terms of who can and what type of flexible work arrangements workplaces can support workers who are experiencing family and domestic violence. And if they needed, time for school drop-offs, etc., because that was also another mechanism that was used by perpetrators to exert control over victim survivors, getting into schools to pick up kids, their children, etc., before the person who's gotten a restraining order gets there on time, etc. So there seems to be a raft of gaps in the knowledge that workplaces should have or need to have, and the training that needs to go behind that. In terms of acknowledging this entitlement of paid domestic violence leave, clearly across the board, it was acknowledged as an early win, and that it's a much needed leave entitlement, but it's been regarded as a first step because of a lot of work that still needs to happen in that space. A number of respondents spoke about that the first year of separation requires more than 10 days of leave, and not all of them were requesting for greater than 10 days of leave as being paid leave. Some were talking about support as being even in terms of them being able to access other types of leave or unpaid leave, because their experience showed that 10 days was not really sufficient. Again, it depended on individual circumstances, family dynamics, etc., as well as their support networks. Then there was also this competing or legislative alignment, where respondents spoke about if they experience adverse action, and this basically means somebody who repeatedly, either pitched up to work a bit late or was taking leave and then unable to finish, project-based work or pieces of work, and then were dismissed. And that's where there's a piece of legislation that falls under adverse action and discrimination. So it could be gender-based discrimination. And so somebody is experiencing discrimination and being dismissed from work. And so that falls under the piece of legislation under unfair dismissal, which is the Fair Work Act 2009, the Discrimination Act, and a number of pieces around discrimination comes under the Discrimination Acts, and again, vary between state and territory levels. Then you've got work health and safety legislation, and then we've got this entitlement of family and domestic violence leave, which is a national entitlement under the Fair Work Act. So because there are competing and legislative overlaps, workplaces again are unclear. And then we have victim survivors themselves who are unclear and have to decide if they are wanting to take this further and seek some legal recourse to get back their jobs or to be compensated for unfair dismissal. They've had to choose which legislation they take that particular appeal up. And so this is where, like I said, community legal centers are providing this much needed service. But unless somebody knows of access to this legal avenue or are members of unions and are seeking this clarification through the union, again, that is not really happening. So there's a lot more training and awareness that needs to happen within the workplace. It was also victim survivors talking about a lack of having their voice heard, where not all of them want, if they reported and accessed this leave, they didn't want to see this all or nothing approach for perpetrators, that perpetrators then are, penalized because it can also be a criminal matter. And so not all of them wanted to see perpetrators or their partners, going down that criminal justice route. So they were saying that they would like to also be heard in terms of what recourse must happen, because it's families and young children involved in it, as well as their safety, their economic dependence, and wanting to ensure that they've got ongoing work arrangements in place. And clearly, that is another area where there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Repeatedly, we heard that organizations lacked trauma-informed approaches. And as I just showed one quote by somebody who was in a senior leadership position who said, but I came back and I was treated as if I was broken and needed to show, needed to go and get clinical psychiatrists clearing, the return to work. And so there was a lack of the way that entire bit was managed by the workplace, so much so that the person felt that in a sense, within quotation marks, they were forced to resign from that particular workplace. And then, as I noted, we, definitely seeing underutilization of that family and domestic violence leave, low uptake, awareness and accessibility issues. Organizations often assume compliance without investigating why family and domestic violence leave is underutilized. We had employees themselves who said, we know it's happening, it's just that we're not receiving enough requests for this. And so, again, it's coming back to creating this awareness. Importance of supportive cultures, and that was repeated. So I'm going to show some, when we analyzed this, we used a multi-level analysis, because what was coming out of our data was that we were seeing individuals talk about stigma, fear, emotional distress that prevented them from disclosing that they were experiencing family and domestic violence, let alone access that leave. A fair few were saying that they instead used their annual leave, or they took personal leave, and that way they didn't have to disclose that they were experiencing violence and harassment. Organizations, there was lack of awareness, unsupportive management, poor workplace cultures. Again, there was a difference between organizations that had dedicated industrial relations advisors, had better relationships with unions, whereas with those that didn't have these types of structural setups, didn't provide first line management responders, like supervisors, etc., with that knowledge that if somebody was experiencing family and domestic violence, how should they be responding? Then definitely, as I pointed out, with the overlapping legislation, gaps in the legislation, it's early days. We've only had this legislation implemented in 2024. Hence, research is important to highlight this. There's societal and policy barriers, so we need more evidence. And then I think on a broader societal level, there are systemic obstacles in terms of attitudes. That's where we're getting this gender-based bias come in, and that we're still seeing stigma, fear, shame around those who are experiencing it, and how they perceive workplaces, their colleagues, etc., will perceive them for being exposed to family and domestic violence. And whether they should seek support or keep this to themselves. So there's a lot around fear of gossip, retaliation, being judged. There's a stigma, confidentiality risk. A number of them spoke about once they disclosed it to their line managers, they could tell that others seem to know about it. So clearly there's within an organization breaches that are happening with confidentiality. Casual workers, and again, in certain sectors that tend to have a higher reliance on casual workers, and we're seeing this in the care sector, hospitality sector, where casual workers fear losing their job or future job. Many use sick leave or, avoid taking this. And also, it's become around, not being rostered. So in that way, they don't have to access this paid leave. And then the need for supportive cultures. And so organizational level, as I said, again, not having policies in place or low levels of awareness, trust and support, again, very low in some organizations. Some do have it, and I will show you some of them that talk about the types of support. Others who clearly seem very unaware or lack knowledge about this. There's definitely privacy concerns, especially in small business, where information spreads easily, unsupportive work cultures, again, industry specific, We're seeing a lot of that happen in the mining sector as well, where there are fly-in, fly-out arrangements. Macro level, there's legal and regulatory challenges. Again, the legislation talks about where workplaces require documentary evidence that should be provided. However, again, it's a spectrum. Some organizations are saying it's sufficient that you've requested for this leave, while others are requesting for some type of medical evidence that they've seen a medical practitioner or sought. Again, with coercive control, you are not going to be seeing physical injury. So workplaces that lack that awareness and knowledge and requests for medical evidence have missed the mark. But then you've got the other extreme where some are asking for very intrusive evidentiary demands, and this is where victim survivors are saying, they feel a lot of shame if they've got to be providing that level of detail. So clearly lack of awareness of training. And this is especially so where our respondents spoke about sectors where there are high turnovers of supervisors and managers, etc. For instance, the retail sector where there's a high turnover rate. So there's not enough training given at that level. And therefore, they are first responders. And so tend not to have very clear guidelines on reporting mechanisms, etc. Then there's still this cultural and societal barriers around those who experience family and domestic violence. And then there's still this, level of shame and stigma for those who experience it. There's also intersections with other workplace issues like sexual harassment, pregnancy loss, menopause leave, increasing stigma, etc. So those who have said if they've had experienced pregnancy loss, if they've taken, personal leave for that, they didn't feel that they were entitled to take family and domestic violence leave. So it's like, take one type of leave, but not both leave for multiple issues that might occur. Our respondents spoke about compounding challenges, where they experience bullying, racism, mental health, in addition to family and domestic violence. So accessing family and domestic violence leave meant that they couldn't access any other leave. They had to take one or the other, or they felt then, that they'll be seen as having too many issues in the workplace. Definitely there were impacts around disclosure, likelihood of how this will impact their careers. That if they reported experiencing family and domestic violence and harassment or multiple types of injuries, etc., then they'll be prevented from applying for promotion, etc. So in a way that acted as an obstacle to their career advancement. Then it was also that organizations lacked comprehensive policy development that looked at these intersections that would have gendered workplace harms. And so in some cases, some respondents spoke about where workplaces perpetuated the harm rather than be supportive. And so we are saying that, workplaces should have more holistic policy integration. They should be implement family and domestic violence leave within gendered equality strategies, look at having trauma-informed workplace cultures for, that are more strategic and longer term, provide specialist training, but ensure the training is ongoing and not once off, accessible support systems in terms of barriers and reporting, etc., and having a culture of trust and care. And so what are we calling for action as part of the 16 days of activism? Promote awareness and education. Have mandatory training versus optional. Foster supportive cultures. Ensure confidentiality. And have collective responsibility, that instead of making this a one side of the coin and having it just around supporting victim survivors, look at the other side of the coin and see what can be done with perpetrator policies and training there. So we are seeing for future implications that there's a need for developing a family and domestic violence strategy in the workplace, that there's perpetrator policies. You can have zero tolerance, where somebody who's known to have enacted violence and harassment is no longer in the workplace. But then, like I just said, we've had respondents who talk about having their voices heard, because not all of them want that zero tolerance or having perpetrators lose their jobs. They feel that if they know where the perpetrator is or their abuser is in the workplace, then in a way that is a time where they feel safe. But it's also a form where there's income generation, because that income is needed for family support, etc. So that zero tolerance is not necessarily a policy or an approach that's welcomed by also, again, it's customizing. A one-size-fit approach is not necessarily welcome. The multi-pronged reintegration and change programs, but there too, there's a fair bit of evidence from the US around change programs, behavior change programs. For instance, we know that more women are affected by family and domestic violence. So men's change programs, and there's a lot being reported in the US from 2010 that show that these programs aren't very effective. But a lot of that is because it's not mandatory training in workplaces. And so when people pitch up, it's usually the same people who actually want change, want to change their behaviors, not necessarily those who are perpetrating violence and harm or are going and seeking out this. So workplaces need to also consider that how they go about these multi-pronged approaches. Definitely revisiting what flexible work arrangements should be like. Some organizations have spoken about having very sophisticated, centralized FDV support and contact, whereas others have not done this. And that's a way of avoiding re-traumatization, so someone doesn't have to go through multiple levels of having to explain why they are needing to access this leave. And also avoiding, things like gossip, etc., confidentiality breaches. Definitely what we have seen is a need for training, raising awareness, and investigating the gendered impacts and biases that are embedded in a lot of these workplace approaches, procedures, etc. And then also what we are seeing come out from the legal research is where looking at work health and safety legislation, especially where there are the impacts of family and domestic violence, and if workplaces know about this or have perpetrators who are using a workplace time, the environment, equipment, etc., to perpetrate violence, is there a vicarious liability on the employer for not ensuring that there's sufficient training and awareness around this. And so that's pretty much where we are in terms of that. Now, next week, again, as part of the 16 days of activism, and since our research team has done this piece of research, which again is very recent, a nascent piece of research, given how recent the legislation has come into effect, we are conducting a symposium. You can use this QR code, but you do need to register. What is really interesting for this particular symposium, we have a representative from the UNILO Asia Pacific region who will talk about Convention 190 and what this means for the wider workplace, for workers, for employers, for trade unions, and what this means in terms of scope and the definition. And then we have a panel of experts from both support services, we've got from unions, we've got employer groups, and we've got from the regulator, this WA state regulator, from government as well. So it's a forum that's going to bring that perspective lens to this particular piece of regulation, and what does this mean for the individual, for organizations, and for nationally and socially, what does this mean for Australia? Thank you for that. I will stop sharing and leave that to John now.
Thanks very much, Kanta. Just reminding everybody, if you want to put in a question, we've already got quite a few, but if you do want to put a question, just go to Slido, and our code is JCIPP. So let's zip into some questions and see what you've got to say about that. Some of them you probably have covered in your remarks, but Sandra Martin asks, do you think that universities and other workplaces can create a safe environment in which managers respond appropriately, or should the worker just go straight to their HR departments? I mean, and I had a question a bit further on about privacy issues, about some people may not want to notify their manager because of privacy issues. So is the best route, or is there advice out there? Do you go to your manager automatically, or can you go straight to the HR department?
That's a very good question, Sandra and John. Sandra asks sector specific, and John, yours is more general, not necessarily to a sector. A few things there. What we've seen from our respondents is pretty much not all of them want to go to their direct line manager. And again, this comes back to the culture in the organization. And so this is where, as part of raising a level of awareness, we are saying organizations need to have safe, anonymous reporting for something that is so personal, and what we are seeing time and again come out, underutilization because of stigma, shame, etc. So if there's fear for accessing a basic entitlement, workplaces should provide that safety. And that doesn't necessarily mean everyone wants to go and ask directly to HR, because again, what we have seen, not all workplaces with HR departments are fully aware of the different types of leave. What needs to happen is organizations need to take a step back and create actual safe anonymous ways to report and access this leave. Some organizations are good in this, in that they've not labeled it as FDV leave. They've not even labeled it as leave. They've just told someone, go and say, I need this for personal reasons, and they will get what it is, because it's going directly to a particular sort of website and be captured there. And then they have dedicated people who are accessing it and then asking the worker, do you need any other type of support? I do know not all organizations have resources to do that, but there's a moral duty here because of violence and harm for workplaces to be able to see, given the resources they have, what's the best way of creating safe reporting and means to access this. So short answer, there isn't go directly to your HR or go directly to your line manager. It just depends on the workplace culture and how comfortable somebody who's experienced violence feels where they can get this.
Okay. Tim Diamond, a great friend of Curtin Corner. Hi, Tim. He mentions how, well, he asks, does the blurring of boundaries between home and work raise problems of privacy? Because usually the law separates work and workers' private lives, but you know, people are often working from home these days. So how does that increased blurring of the boundaries between private life and work impact on the application of the family and domestic violence leave?
Oh, I think we definitely saw a lot of that, because, and that's one of the reasons why we had the online survey, because we had respondents who spoke about they work from home. And so if they've got the perpetrator or, you know, their partner, if it's intimate partner violence, also working from home, then that's where it's being blurred. So there's a lot of coercive control taking place in the home environment. And we saw a lot of that happen during COVID when, you know, it was remote work. But in saying that, that was within the work environment, so it's definitely blurred. But it's also happening now where we've got this fly-in, fly-out arrangements where somebody's controlling it from a remote work location, what's happening at home. And we've had respondents who said, well, you know, I'm undertaking work at this time, but I'm being monitored when I leave, you know, my work, or even get into the car when there are two people getting in. It's being monitored. So someone spoke about Uber drivers are being, you know, Uber's been asked to drive past their place of, you know, that's residence. So that is definitely happening. So that blurring is definitely taking place between home and work co-located spaces. We're also seeing it's happening, you know, when you're having a meeting outside a co-located workspace, which is why the International Labour Organization expanded the definition of what the world of work looks like now, because it's changed.
Okay, Helen Verhoff, another great friend of Curtin Corner. Hi, Helen. Asked a couple of questions. One was, how much do you think embarrassment is impacting accessing leave, and how can organisations reinforce to the victims that the shame's not theirs? I mean, this sounds like from some of your quotes you were giving, it's a combination of embarrassment and shame, etc. Yeah.
Yes, great question, Helen. This is where we're saying we need to remove that stigma, that it's not the individual's fault, but that's not only, you know, at a workplace. That's more a systemic thing. It's also how society is viewing this. So therefore, there's got to be multiple, you know, a multi-pronged approach that must happen across the board. Hence why we're also saying we need a lot of unions to be involved in it, because they can talk to their members, and there's got to be a lot of that awareness raising happening at multiple forums. But in saying that, workplaces, like we said, at the moment, the legislation addresses one side of the coin, and it's very much around support to victim survivors. It is not looking at the other side, who is perpetrating the violence. And so it's workplaces then that also need to understand that perpetrators are also in the workplace. Like unions are also representatives of both victim survivors and perpetrators. So there's education and awareness raising that has to happen at multiple levels to remove that stigma.
Okay. Tim asks, what responsibility does a manager have to prioritise security in a workplace with vulnerable people, e.g. at a school, if a perpetrator can follow a victim survivor there? So, I mean, there's how much responsibility can a manager have in terms of securing their workplace? So I guess the same thing would also happen with customers who can also be violent.
And this is where John and Tim, you know, overlaying of legislation, because there's a duty of care under work health and safety legislation. And so this is where, you know, ensuring that you don't get perpetrators coming into the workplace. And some are very good that once they know about it, then they've got security, etc. But I think this bit about, so there's work health and safety, and then there's the Fair Work Act that talks about, you know, the leave procedures, etc. And also adverse action, that if somebody's experiencing this, then they're not a burden to the organization. So they shouldn't be experiencing adverse action in terms of discrimination, etc. So workplaces, yes, do have that across multiple legislations to ensure that there's safety.
Sure. And the last comment actually was Helen's letting Tim know that at Curtin, for example, the manager should connect the person to a safer community team, which is something that Curtin University has. Other organisations may have something similar, and they work confidentially with them on protection. So as you said, some organisations have a designated either a website or a designated person who is not their direct line manager potentially, or this sort of anonymous bureaucracy. So you can be reasonably confident the person you're talking to is more likely to understand your needs. So I think, and obviously for bigger organisations, that's more possible than perhaps for smaller organisations.
In saying that, John, it was also very interesting. We had respondents from larger organizations who said that, you know, they didn't receive that support. Or like the one quote, you know, that I had with somebody who was in a senior leadership role said, when they returned, then they were put onto a performance review.
Yeah. So being big isn't sufficient, but it might be a necessary condition sometimes for those sorts of positions. It certainly would make it easier for the organisation because they've got more resources. Obviously, for smaller organisations, it's a bit trickier. Yeah.
Yes, and this is also the other thing with smaller businesses, that seems to be pretty rife, and especially because they tend to employ vulnerable workers. You know, it could be very gendered, a lot more women, you know, very young people, much older people, or on casual contracts. And the casual contract was the concerning one because almost all of them who we spoke to, who were on casual work arrangements, said they pretty much couldn't access paid leave because they were just not rostered.
Yeah, important. Well, look, Kanta, it's already just after 5:15, so we should probably call it a day. But you've given us a lot. Well, firstly, a really comprehensive presentation, a lot of interesting information in your presentation. Good luck with your big forum next week, and if anybody wants to go, please check that out. And there is a website in the Curtin Corner email that I sent out advertising today's presentation. There is a link there to a number of events that are happening in the 16 days of activism, so you can go there. I'm pretty sure Kanta's. Am I right in saying your workshop will be there as well? So you can go there, find out what's happening in your own neighbourhood and community, and it's a really important issue. So thanks very much for bringing it to our attention again this week, Kanta. So terrific, thanks.
Thanks, John, and to everyone who's taken the time off away from cricket to attend.
Fair enough. Okay, and just for those of you who are still here, next Friday, we don't have a Curtin Corner next Friday, but in a fortnight's time, 5th of December, we do have our final Curtin Corner for the year. It's a face-to-face seminar starting at 4:30, and the speaker is Michael Sheldrick, who's a West Australian making big waves around the world. He's discussing his new book, From Ideas to Impact, Influencing and Implementing Change. Promises to be a really interesting talk, so hopefully we'll see you next time. Good night.